Hello, everyone, and welcome to Uncivil Law, where we learn through the misfortunes of others. If you're enjoying our legal education content, please remember to subscribe. Today, we ask the question, is conspiracy to commit murder for hire a crime of violence? Could go either way. That is the case we have to decide in the United States of America versus David Anthony Runyon. In this case, Mr. Runyon was part of a conspiracy to commit murder for hire. The murder, in fact, happened, and he was charged and convicted. And we have to determine whether the conspiracy to commit the murder for hire qualifies as a crime of violence. Let's get started with this. The murder in this case was highly planned. Briefly, the facts are set out in more detail in another opinion, but the facts show that Katharina Voss, the wife of Corey Voss, a U.S. Navy officer, had been engaged in an extramarital affair with Michael Dravin. An affair? In my military, it's more likely than you think. Catherine and Davrin decided to murder Voss in the hope of gaining Voss's Navy death benefits and life insurance proceeds. Well, that's twice that they haven't consulted the Uniform Code of Military Justice. That could be a problem with the murder. To carry out this murder, Dravin hired David Runyon, who Dravin had met as a co-participant in a drug research study. Drug research partners now are engaged in murders for hire. I don't know how exactly that conversation goes. How do you determine your drug research buddy is a good candidate to approach for a murder for hire? I don't know the answer to these questions. Shortly before the crime, Katharina opened an account at a branch of a local bank in Newport News with a $5 deposit. Thereafter, on the night of the murder, Katharina sent Voss to the bank for an ATM withdrawal. So she opened an account with $5 and she sent her hubby to get some money from the ATM. Yeah, video surveillance of the scene showed that while Voss stood at the ATM, an unidentified man, later found to be Runyon, entered Voss's pickup truck. Voss then drove away from the ATM, but returned a few minutes later and attempted another withdrawal, which was denied due to insufficient funds. That next morning, Voss was found dead in his pickup truck at a parking lot near the bank, having been shot 5 times at close range. Compelling evidence connected the bullet used in the murder to Runyon. So we have an affair. We've got lovers, want to knock off the husband. The wife sets up the husband. They have a conspiracy to commit murder. The husband goes to withdraw money from the ATM. There's no money in the ATM. Meanwhile, the assassin enters the pickup truck. They try to drive away, and shortly thereafter, he's found with multiple gunshot wounds, being killed by his wife as part of the affair, conspiracy, murder for hire stuff. So, good times had by all that one. Runyon, Katharina, and Dravin were ultimately arrested and charged with murder of Voss and related offenses. Katharina pleaded guilty to all counts and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Runyon and Dravin proceeded to trial with the government seeking the death penalty against Runyon, who is the actual murderer. So they didn't actually go for the death penalty for the other guys. Not sure why, because you could get them all murder for hire as part of a conspiracy, but they only went for the death penalty for the actual murderer. So, okay. The jury returned a verdict finding both Runyon and Dravin guilty of conspiracy to commit murder for hire, carjacking, because he entered the car, and murder with use of a firearm in relation to a crime of violence. Dravin was sentenced to life imprisonment while the trial continues against Runyon pursuant to the Federal Death Penalty Act. So yeah, this did not end well for the parties involved. We got life sentences for 2, and then we got the death penalty for the third person. After making its findings on the aggravating and mitigating factors presented to the jury unanimously recommended the death sentence on 2 counts, conspiracy to commit murder for hire and murder in connection with the use of a firearm in relation to a crime of violence, and a recommended life imprisonment on the carjacking count. And the district court then imposed the recommended sentences and were in judgment on December the 4th. So I guess there is some judgment. Mr. Voss whacked by his wife and lover and random guy who are now in jail forever with one guy facing the death penalty. And we have to determine the death penalty guy is sad. He'd like to not be executed by the government for his, murder for hire conspiracy. And he's sad, and he'd like to argue, I didn't actually commit a crime of violence. So it's totally cool. Okay, let's go with that. Let's see, did we commit a crime of violence? Let's give that a try. With respect to the first issue certified in appeal, Runyon contends his conviction for violating the relative U.S. law is invalid, and this is the part that we all wanted to see, because the predicate crimes relied on for the conviction, conspiracy to commit murder for hire, and carjacking do not qualify as crimes of violence. This is his legal argument. Let's make sure that we understand his legal argument correctly. He says his convictions are invalid because he didn't commit a crime of violence. Because the predicate crimes, conspiracy to commit murder for hire and carjacking, are not crimes of violence. The carjacking and the conspiracy to commit murder are not crimes of violence. This is the legal argument we want to go with. Okay, let's give that a shot, I guess. Runyon argues that neither the conspiracy to commit murder for hire nor carjacking is crime of violence. This is a good part, because neither crime necessarily requires the use of physical force. The conspiracy to commit murder for hire and carjacking are not crimes of violence because it isn't necessary that you would use physical force in the commission of those crimes. The carjacking and the conspiracy for murder for hire, there's no necessary element of violence in either of those. All right. Because the relevant law requires us to focus on the elements of the offense, defining crime of violence as a felony that has an element of the use of force, we apply the categorical approach. So we're looking at this categorically. Does it categorically, and that would be to say in every instance, require violence? Is it categorically a crime of violence? Okay. Federal law defines physical force to mean violent force. That is, force capable of causing physical pain or injury to another person. And that, of course, would include causing death to another person. That might be an example of force that would cause physical pain or injury. The murder. That would seem to qualify, yes. While conspiracy alone does not necessarily implicate the use of force. So in this sentence, we're thinking about all conspiracies, all possible conspiracies. So all possible conspiracies do not necessarily implicate the use of force. That's true. There are a whole number of crimes, or any number of crimes, many crimes, potentially, which do not involve the use of force. And conspiracy to commit those crimes doesn't necessarily involve the use of force. So conspiracy, in the abstract, doesn't necessarily require force. Fair. However, conspiracy in the context of this particular offense is different because it is heightened mens rea, as well as the element that death would result. So not every conspiracy does physical force make, but when death results, maybe that's different. As already noted, an act that results in death obviously requires physical force, such as the shooting multiple times. And a death resulting from conspiracy to commit murder for hire has a requisite mens rea to constitute the use of physical force. That is one of the elements of conspiracy to commit murder. It's like you want the death to occur, so that would suggest the use of force, yeah. In a prior case, we've considered whether a federal statute that prohibits knowingly engaging in conduct and thereby causing bodily injury to another person with intent to retaliate against the person for serving as a witness satisfied the force clause. And we conclude it did. Such is the case here. This law's mens rea elements cannot be limited to their individual clauses. If a defendant willingly agrees to enter a conspiracy with the specific intent that a murder be committed for money and death results from that agreement, which, is what a murder for hire would be, it follows that the defendant acted with specific intent to bring about the death of the conspiracy victim. I didn't have intent to commit murder in the conspiracy to commit the murder. And the specific intent ensures the victim's death was necessarily the result of physical force and not merely from negligent or accident. That would be what murder is. That's kind of what you were hoping for. Thus, we conclude the conspiracy to commit murder for hire or death results in violation of law is a crime of violence under the force clause, and accordingly we reject the argument that the conviction is invalid. Yeah, no, this seems pretty valid. I did purposefully and intentionally enter a plan which design and scheme was that a guy would die, and that death did in fact occur. But I had no violence in my heart because there's nothing saying that I was going to commit violence in my murder for hire conspiracy. I guess we can try anything even if it doesn't make any sense. Okay. Thus, that brings us to the end of our discussion of United States of America versus David Anthony Runyon. In this case, Mr. Runyon entered a murder for hire conspiracy because a wife and their lover wanted to off their husband. And the wife set their husband up, which was a very, very mean thing to do. Very, very mean. That's very mean. This poor husband was trying to help you out. You set him up. You set up a fake bank account. Well, it wasn't really fake. It just didn't have any money in it. And you said to him, hey, honey, why don't you go to the ATM and withdraw some money for me? And being a dutiful husband, he said, okay. He went to the ATM to get money. And there was no money in the account, and he was probably a little bit frustrated, but he didn't realize how frustrated he was going to be because in the interim, Mr. Runyon over here snuck into his truck and then shot him several times, and he died. That was a very, very mean thing to do to your husband. He didn't do anything wrong. And so, yeah, all the parties basically go to jail forever. The wife and the lover get life imprisonment, and Mr. Runyon was sentenced to death by a jury. And the Court of Appeals says, yeah, this looks like it was a crime of violence, the conspiracy to commit the murder. So we don't really know what you're talking about. So yeah, no. And that brings us to the end of the discussion of this case. Thank you so much for being part of the Uncivil Law family. If you enjoyed this legal education content, please hit the subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. We appreciate your continuing support. Until later, my friends, cheers and goodbye.